and Equisearch, the state attorney's office, the FBI, all the major investigative agencies involved, FDLE, all believe that there's a very strong possibility that this is indeed the find that they have been looking for.
And Bob Killing has been on top of the story. In fact, Bob, you've been breaking details on this case from the very beginning, and your sources right now leading towards this being Kaylee?
Absolutely. And it's interesting hearing the sheriff's briefing. I had spoken with him on the phone about 15 minutes before he gave his news conference, and he was specific to say that it was actually a child's skeleton inside a plastic bag. During his news conference, he said he had talked to the state attorney's office who was advising him to limit the amount of detail. So perhaps that's coming into play on the amount of information that he was releasing in that news conference. He did talk about the fact that it did not appear that there were any clothes there with the remains. And one statement that came to my mind was back when we reported that according to Leonard Padilla's employees, at one point when they were with Casey Anthony guarding her after they had gotten her out of jail, she was riding in a car with them, and according to two witnesses who heard her say this, she said, talking about the investigators, they don't know what they're doing, they haven't even found the clothes yet. That's what came to my mind when hearing from the sheriff in his news conference, that there did not appear to be any clothes around what is, he's confirming at least, does appear to be a small child's skull, but he was not confirming what he told us the first time, that it was actually a skeleton inside a plastic bag. So there's a little bit of discrepancy there.
And let's talk about Cindy Anthony for a moment. Bob, you I remember when we had that false alarm over at the Little Econ River, and you were the one who told her, I believe live on the air, you said police have just confirmed that what was found is not your granddaughter. However, in this particular case, she is in direct contact with the investigators who have called her out. They're in California right now. They were on Larry King Live, and they have said this is what's happening. They're on their way back. And I know that there are cars at the Anthony home right now. People have been showing up. So different scenario, and from what we know, she has been in contact with investigators.
Yeah, that's right, Martha. Clearly the circumstance is completely different here, and the fact that they've put the FBI lab at Quantico on alert, that's also very significant in terms of the find. And again, I mean, at very minimum, a child's skull has been found out there. That in and of itself makes this far above any of these other discoveries that turned out to be nothing. This is something, regardless of who the skull belongs to. So it's a question of making that identification. And you have to go back and think of George and Cindy Anthony at this point on a plane, a cross-country flight from California all the way to Florida, not expected to get in until around 5 o'clock. I can't imagine how difficult it is for them right now, having to wait and wonder, having gotten that call some hours ago of this find that was made.
And let's get back to that find, Bob. It was really on this day, a rainy day, a very dreary day, such a random discovery. As we heard earlier, this area was inundated by water during Tropical Storm Faye. The first time this area was searched, it was flooded. An apparent meter reader, a county employee just doing his job, stumbles upon this presumably a bag that has this skull and other remains inside. So really a lucky find for every investigator involved in this.
It's a lucky find. It's a huge break for the investigation in terms of if, as what we've heard early on was true, that they found at least a skull and possibly a skeleton inside these remains. The fact that it is relatively intact, the fact that it may have been exposed to the elements for almost 6 months now, the fact that it was underwater, and the fact that it hasn't been scattered by animals at this point is just a huge break. And in talking with a source from the state attorney's office, they say if indeed this turns out to be Kaylee's remains, then the death penalty could well be back on the table. Remember, it was just about a week ago that they notified Jose Baez in writing that they didn't plan to go for the death penalty. But that was before this find, and if it's confirmed that these are Kaylee's remains, then in terms of the investigation, in terms of this first-degree murder indictment that Casey is facing, it's a whole new ballgame.
So they can go back on that and say, never mind, we will pursue the death penalty.
That's what a source is telling me. And given the fact that Jose Baez has asked for more time, asked for a continuance, and asking for this change of venue, this is going to give them more time to process this newfound evidence, and it's certainly a big break for the prosecution, no doubt about it, if indeed it turns out that these are Kaylee's remains.
And Bob, let's talk about that evidence again. This is obviously a fluid situation. We're hearing bits and pieces. The sheriff says one thing, the skull found. There's talk out there that a skeleton, a bag. From what you understand and what your sources are telling you, going right to the source, Bob, how were the skull remains, what were found, preserved? We're talking about weeks, months, where this little girl has been missing. If, again, this is Caylee Anthony, how well preserved are these remains?
Well, from the investigators I've talked with on the scene, they're not giving me a specific description of how well preserved they are, but I've heard from several sources that they were in some sort of plastic bag. And that is a big break just in and of itself in terms of the alternate, which would be that perhaps the body was just left in the woods and exposed to the elements. So just the fact that they are in some sort of bag or something to protect them could potentially be very valuable for prosecutors, for investigators, for the FBI lab personnel to go back in there. And they have such sophisticated science these days that it is possible that even after all these months, the remains that were found out there could yield some very significant clues, some very significant evidence to add in the current case against Casey.
We're talking that animals hadn't gotten to it. I don't mean to be in ill taste right now, but we understand that they weren't disturbed. Is that what we're to understand?
Well, we don't have that specific level of information yet, but you have to consider the fact that 9:30 this morning, this is a meter reader just going out and doing his or her thing in the course of their job, finding this bag. And apparently this was just so obvious to this person that they contact the authorities. The way it's been described to me was that a sergeant, a deputy sergeant actually went out there and almost immediately was convinced these were human remains, that it appeared to be a young child. So obviously that gives you some indication of the level of preservation and literally the amount of remains that were there, that it was just so obvious from the get-go that these were not animal bones, as they've found so many, many times in the search for Caylee. So it does appear, at least on the surface, given the early state of this investigation and this find, that they do have something significant to work with. We have the sheriff saying that at the very least we have what appears to be a small child's skull. So this is the real thing, regardless of whom it turns out to be.
And this is certainly going to be a long, long process. People see it on TV, Bob, and they think that it happens like that, evidence, DNA, and all that kind of stuff. But this, as the sheriff said, is going to be a long process. Evidence has to be sent away. It could take weeks to come back, and then they have to piece this all together.